I was getting to talk today on faculty workload assignments, and you've been here as long as I have. You get to talk about the really exciting, fun stuff, huh? Not too glamorous, maybe, but something that's important. So we're going to just kind of go through some policy and some examples today, and talk about what these things are, what they do, and why we have them. And when we talk about a faculty workload agreement, you may hear it called a position description. They go by a variety of names, but basically what we're talking about are documents that tell faculty how their workload for the year should be split. You're basically telling them how they should be spending their time that year, in terms of dividing it into typically the three major areas of responsibility: teaching, research, and service. Although certainly there are other areas of responsibility that can be put on there as well. We typically think of these, as something we do at the time of hiring, but policy does require that we do periodic review of these and that we update them as well. Let's start out by taking a look at NDSU policy 350.1.5. I kind of color coded a couple of areas here. The portion in yellow is typically referring to what we do at the point of hire for a new faculty member. For a faculty appointment, the contract consists of the letter that offers them the position, the annual notice of the renewal terms, the current job description, and then the policies and procedures of the university as well as the State Board of Higher Education. The red part, though, is equally important there. The department chair or head of an academic unit will ensure that all faculty have job descriptions and that they are periodically reviewed and updated. So that is a really important part of this, of making sure that everybody's got one, and making sure that we take a look at them on a regular basis and that we update them on a regular basis. The last part, the blue part, is the part that ties this to promotion, tenure, and evaluation requirements. Each job description shall specify how a faculty member's assigned responsibilities will be allocated among teaching, research, and service, which will determine the weight to be given to each area of responsibility for tenure, promotion, and continuing evaluations. And that just makes sense, right? If the workload agreement or the position description is going to indicate to faculty how they should be spending their time during the year, then how they spend their time should be tied to how they're going to be evaluated. We want to make sure that we evaluate them accurately based on what we ask them to do, rather than doing an evaluation that is based on something that might be different. The two big important points of this are first off, just that we need to tie these to those PTE expectations. And the second is that workload agreements are not static. They need to be reviewed on a regular basis. They need to be updated as needed. They need to be changed as needed. And this is tied into other policies as well. This is State Board of Higher Ed policy 605.1.5B2. Tenured and probationary faculty contract shall identify the faculty member's tenure plan, describe their duties and goals. Contract shall specify the distribution of the criteria used for evaluating performance, and those provisions shall be reviewed and, when appropriate, revised as a part of the faculty member's periodic evaluations. And then NDSU policy 352, and there are a number of sections here. From 1.3, we need to make sure that promotion and tenure evaluation criteria are aligned with those official position descriptions. And then 3.1, the blue section there, each academic unit shall specify the relative emphasis on teaching, research, and service, and the extent to which a faculty member's assigned responsibilities can be allocated among teaching, research, and service. And it does then go on to make a distinction there between expectations for faculty and professor of practice and research positions, and that those may be quite different from the responsibilities for our tenure line faculty. And then in 4.7, This is referring to post-tenure review. I think sometimes we think about these position descriptions as something for new hires. We think about them as critical for the review for a promotion to associate with tenure. But it's equally important to keep these in mind in doing evaluations and looking at positions for tenured faculty as well. And that's embedded in 352 rather, section 4.7. Annual reviews of tenured faculty shall include an evaluation of the faculty member's performance relative to the current position description. So consistently from the time we hire somebody to the time they leave that position, we are talking about having a position description that reflects what it is that's expected of that individual for that year, and that is consistent and consistently ties in with the PTE evaluations in the department, or the PTE standards in the department. I'll give you some examples here, and I pull these from three departments, from HDFS, because I'm most familiar with it, from math, and from coatings and polymeric materials. I did get permission from all three department heads to use these, and they just illustrate a couple of things. First off, I think they illustrate the tremendous diversity that we have among our departments, and how departments think about teaching, how they assign responsibility for teaching, where research fits in all of that. And it illustrates the flexibility that we need to have in terms of thinking about these. This is really not, I think, a one size fits all model. Certainly there's some things that are consistent that we can make sure we have across the board, but there's going to need to be a lot of variation in how we think about this from department to department. So what I'm going to share with you here are not PTE guidelines here, but they are statements that these departments have about workload. So these are separate statements about workload that they use to define what the expectations are. And you'll be able to see, I think, how these link up the position description or the workload agreement with the promotion and tenure and evaluation requirements. So if we start off with HDFS, which is my home department, we use a standard workload of 40% teaching, 10% advising, 40% research, and 10% service. And that 40% teaching includes typically is a 2-and-2 load, right? So 2 classes in the fall, 2 classes in the spring. And again, these are partial, so I've cut and pasted these to leave out some of the non-essential material here. But you can see there it states right off the bat that all HDFS faculty who aren't on leave, who are on modified duties, will have a workload each year that includes teaching and service. Tenure track and tenure line faculty will also have a workload that includes research. And then they go on to define what is a standard class, right? So in HDFS, a 3-credit course is considered to require 10% of a faculty member's annual workload. So a 1-credit course is 3.3%, 2-credit course is 6.67%, taking into account that variability. So 10% of annual workload equates to 20% of one semester's workload. So in a typical semester, each 3-credit course that a faculty member is teaching is considered to take 20% of their time for that semester. So again, a 2-and-2 load across 2 academic semesters is counted as a 40% teaching load. Again, HDFS then goes on to define what the standard teaching load is, which is 3 or 4 didactic 3-credit courses per year. They go through the exceptions there, the differences for lecturers and for senior lecturers. And then they go into the fact that a lower teaching load may be negotiated with the department head, and they make reference to another point there. But again, what we're looking at there is a flexibility on the part of the department to recognize that these things may need to change, either because of concerns that the faculty member has, or needs that the faculty member has, or needs that the department has as well. HDFS then goes on to define the standard service load for faculty as being 10%, but again, noting that that is flexible and can be changed from year to year as well. And then the advising section for HDFS, undergrad advising 5% of workload, graduate advising for an additional 5%. And there is a separate section that I don't present here that goes into modifying this for graduate faculty who have a high graduate advising workload, either in terms of dissertation advising, thesis advising, research hours, or related areas like that that are specific for graduate students. All right, math does something very, very similar. But again, you'll notice that there are subtle and sometimes significant differences here that reflect the differences in the departments. So in mathematics, they defined a standard workload as 60% teaching, 30% research, and 10% service. So you can see that in terms of the percentage allocated, the teaching allocation is a little bit higher than HDFS was. They give you examples there of what this means. So your 30% research, if you're the typical faculty member, what does that mean? It means you'll publish in peer referee forums, you'll present at conferences, you'll look for financial support, you'll review articles, and you'll advise graduate students. So a little bit different from HDFS, but again, the nice thing here is this is clearly defined. If you're a faculty member in math, you've got very clear expectations there about what your research load is expected, or what's expected from you as part of your research load. For teaching, now one of the things you'll see here is if you look at this first paragraph, you'll see that in math, the typical load is 2 regular courses per semester. So that is a 2 and 2 load. HDFS is counting that as 40% with another 10% for advising. So HDFS is counting that as a 50% load. In math, if we go back, we're looking at that as a 60% load, and advising is included in the 60% as well. So you're teaching the same number of courses, but as I think we all understand, the type of courses can differ within department and certainly can differ across departments. So what is a 2 and 2 load in one department may take a larger or a smaller percentage of a faculty member's time than a 2 and 2 load in another department. So having that kind of flexibility to match up what you're doing with the academic demands of your unit, I think are important. And there are the other issues here, or the other responsibilities for teaching in the math department: supervising the recitation instructors, the lab instructors, and the graders, working in the peer review aspects of the department, helping out with assessment, helping the undergrad students, and supervising those students in senior seminar. And then math defines service as those assignments assigned by the chair. The graduate student supervisory committees are listed here as service rather than advising, which a lot of departments do. University and college committees here, and then regularly participating in the departmental functions, right? The department meetings, the departmental seminars, the colloquia, and then the training activities as required by the university policy. So again, a little different from what HDFS defines, but again, both of them are very clear, very straightforward, and they give faculty an idea of what they ought to be doing for those time percentages. All right, coatings and polymeric materials. Again, a little different from either of the one we've seen. What we're looking at here is a normal distribution of workload for tenure line faculty: 35% teaching, 50% research, and 15% service. And again, the third bullet point here I think is really important. This can vary depending on individual situations and will be assessed each year at the time of annual evaluation. So that gives you a good way to stay current and to make sure of make sure that you've got a good match up there between what an individual is doing and what's expected of them. Excuse me. Okay, so teaching for coatings and polymeric materials. General expectation that faculty will teach in the 400, 600 level courses and then teach at least one 700 level courses. And in bold there, that second section, over a 2-year period, a typical faculty member of the department will teach 1 course per semester for 3 semesters, with 1 semester where classroom teaching is not required, and this may vary widely. So again, different percentage appointments, different way to rotate through the classes, but again, each of these models works for the particular department that you're looking at, and each model is uniquely defined for that department, which is part of the whole point of this. Research advising. is included under teaching as well. And that's something I know that a lot of the departments struggle with, right? Do you count the number of students that you have? Do you increase or decrease the teaching percentage based on the number of graduate students that you're working with? There's a lot of variability there across campus. Some departments do include that as a separate category, and it can vary from year to year. Other departments do not include that as a separate category. It's kind of an add-on offload kind of thing. So there's a lot of variability there. And again, I think departments are doing what works for them. And I know in HGFS, for example, we struggled over the years with how to reflect that, particularly as we added a doctoral program, because you do that and you have a lot of other responsibilities. Where do you put those? Rather than just adding them on as overload and unpaid overload, where do you add those onto? So that's something that each department, I think, has to consider for themselves and figure out what's going to work best for them. Research expectations: maintaining active national and internationally recognized research programs, look for funding, mentor grad students, mentor postdocs, present papers at meetings, present papers for peer-reviewed journals, monitor and control your research expenditures that are funded by outside agencies. Again, fairly typical stuff, but laid out very clearly and very nicely. And then service, and they go into great detail here. So you can see there's a lot of detail there about what departmental service is, ranging from participating in departmental meetings to making sure you've got a syllabus at the start of your classes. So they outline responsibilities for departmental service, for college or university service, and then for service outside the university. And then they define expectations for professor of practice as well. And this is something that, we're talking primarily today about tenure line faculty, but this is something for professors of practice as well that needs to be done. And consideration given to both professor of practice and research professor positions, that they're very different typically from the standard tenure line positions. So their workload agreements are going to need to be different. All right, so we know that we need a link between the workload agreement and actually, okay, got a little ahead of myself there. Let's just skip to this. So we're talking about requirement that we review these workload agreements on at least somewhat of a regular basis, right? So this is 352.4.1. If you read down the last few lines there, periodic reviews may result in changes in responsibilities, in modified expectations and or altered goals for performance. So we are looking at both the State Board of Higher Ed policies as well as the NDSU policies that say that we need to look at workload agreements and review them on a regular basis. The question comes up, I think, for all of us of what does a regular basis mean? The State Board of Higher Education says we need to review them when appropriate. NDSU in our policy manual says we need to review them periodically. And what we found out last summer when the State Board auditors were on campus is that the State Board, in terms of practice, the auditors interpret appropriate and periodically as annually. And so one of the things that happened last year is that they dinged us in some parts of our audit because we did not have workload descriptions or agreements or position descriptions for all faculty. And we were not, for the ones that we did have, we were not reviewing them annually. So there is apparently that expectation from the people who are responsible for evaluating us on the State Board policy that when appropriate and periodically will mean an annual or a yearly review. So the question comes up then, I think, of what is this going to look like if we are going to do an annual evaluation or an annual review of workload agreements. What is it going to look like? Right now, One of the things that we know from across the campus is that we do this very, very differently. We also know that not all colleges and departments are doing this. In human sciences and education, I was trying to think of when we first started doing this, but I believe we first started doing annual workload agreements about 20 years ago. Virginia Clark Johnson, who was our dean, was a real stickler for policy, at least the part that was black and white. And her evaluation of periodically was annually. And so we started doing it about 20 years ago. We started doing these position descriptions on an annual basis. Most of our departments do this in the fall when faculty are back on campus. So sometime late August, early September, faculty work with their department head to prepare an annual workload agreement that gets signed by the faculty member, gets signed by the department head, and we file it here in the dean's office. We do have one unit that does them in the spring, that does them in April, so that when faculty leave for the summer, their workload agreements for the following year are done and are ready. We are looking at, it's my understanding that what we're looking at right now, and I know John and Margaret are online here as well, if you guys want to jump in and make any comments here. But it's my understanding that what we are looking at is looking at implementing that annual review process the way the board is interpreting it, and doing it in the spring, early summer with that workload agreement really as a page 2 of that annual contract, right? So we have to do an annual contract that we sign and return to the dean's office in June. And we are looking at including a workload agreement or a position description as a page 2 of that. So we would handle all of this in the late spring or early summer. To give you an idea, this is one of my old ones. This is the format that we use in HDFS. The rest of the college uses something that's similar to this. We started out there just with the statement about, everybody is subject to the rules and policies of the Board of Higher Ed, IndieISSU, and whatever college or department you're in. Reference to performance of faculty members being reviewed on an annual basis, additional reviews for untenured faculty, post-tenure evaluation for tenure, and that continuation of your academic appointment is contingent upon satisfactory progress toward professional goals and job performance, and any changes in status are contingent on final approval by the board. Statement in there that your teaching, research, and service responsibilities are determined by the department and are subject to change, and then states for your year what you're doing. So this was my 2017-2018 year, when my appointment was entirely non-administrative. So you can see teaching advising was 50%, and it spells out that I would teach 4 courses over fall and spring, that I would do advising for undergrad and grad, that my scholarly activity was 35%, and that was, conduct research, publish and present it, make efforts to obtain external funding if I didn't have any at the current moment, and then 10%, departmental governance, college, university, or community, national professional organizations. At the time, I was helping to coordinate a statistical consulting program for our college for faculty and doctoral students, so that's in there. And then I had a small administrative appointment at the time to coordinate a graduate program within the department. And then you can see that next line there, all faculty are expected to contribute to a positive work environment through cooperation and collaboration with others, by developing and maintaining good working relationships with faculty, staff, employees, and students. That is what we used to refer to as the Schnell Addendum. That was added to our position descriptions when Dr. Schnell was provost, and was a way to address collegiality. And so you can see I prepared this and submitted it to my department head. My department head signed it, submitted it to the dean. Margaret signed it. And then a copy went in my file here in the dean's office, and one was returned to Joel as my department head, as well as to me, so that I would have a copy of that as well. One of the things, as we talk about making sure that this is something we're done university wide. Margaret gave us an example this week of a potential form that could be used. So you can see it's the same kind of basic format. Your teaching, advising, your research, scholarly, creative activities, your service and other activities, and there's a place there for you to list it, and your total effort. One of the things that I think, as we have talked about this as a group of deans with Margaret, one of the things that has become really clear is that there are some things that need to be on here for everybody, for consistency, for the university's usage. But then again, there's so much diversity among the departments that we have to have a lot of flexibility here in terms of how faculty can work with this, and how it can be modified and adapted to fit the needs of the individual units within the colleges. All right, before we open up for questions, a couple of takeaways here. Again, the biggest thing here is just how much variability is. Over the years, I think we have made some efforts at times to use a one-size-fits-all model on a lot of different things. And I think the workload descriptions are going to be one of those things we have to really recognize the variability among our departments and among our colleges there, because there's a huge amount of variability in that ratio of research, teaching, and service appointments. There's a lot of variability in how teaching credits are assigned and counted, how those graduate responsibilities are counted, and what our research expectations are. And so we have to keep that in mind. We also have to remember that those responsibilities can vary from year to year. And, let's face it, for a lot of faculty, they probably should vary from year to year for a variety of reasons, most all of them good. But that variability needs to be documented, right? There needs to be an official statement of workload. It needs to be signed, and it needs to be filed in your dean's office. So there really is, we were all threatened. If you were like me and my cohort, we were all threatened in junior high and high school with things that were going to go into our permanent files, right? Well, there is a permanent file, and it's in the dean's office. So we have to keep a record there and make sure we've got that. Periodic review is being interpreted as annual review. So those position descriptions need to be evaluated and reviewed and signed yearly, even if there aren't any changes. At one point in our college, we were experimenting with, if there wasn't a change from year to year, the faculty member could sign the bottom of the form with the New Year's date on it, signifying that they had read it, that there were no changes, and it was good for another year. That didn't work out for a lot of reasons. It just was a lot easier to do a new workload agreement for the new year and get the new signatures. And again, at the very, very last point there, that lack of updating was a deficiency area in our most recent audit. And it's something that we need to think about and make sure that we're staying current on there, so that we don't give the board something that an excuse to find us in a deficiency area. All right, that look at the time. That's all that I have. I know that I talk really fast, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to unshare the screen here. Stop sharing. There we go. Get back to my screen. All right, there, I've got you all back now. And the chat is open there. There's too many of you for me to see your hands if you raise them. So I think what we can do is either just type your question into the chat or just shout it out, and I'll do what I can to answer. And like I said, we've got John in here, we've got Margaret here, so hopefully we can answer any questions that you have along the way. Question in the chat is from Amy Gore. How should we, or how do other units handle the thesis and dissertation credit classes? For example, when a faculty member is chairing an MA thesis and an instructor of record for credit-bearing MA thesis classes. That's a really, really good question. Our office met this morning with the consultants to talk about credit load and how we evaluate these things. And in our college, it's done completely differently, I think, by the different units. In HDFS, a certain amount of sharing thesis or sharing dissertation credits or sharing doctoral student research credits simply goes into that 10% advising, that 5% that is graduate advising. We do have standards for what is excessive. And once you get to that point, what you would do is talk to the department head, and then you would get your workload adjusted for the coming year to take into account the larger number of students that you have. But there's a lot of variability out there, Amy, and my guess is that a lot of that is simply done as offload, and it's technically non-compensated, and it just is something that faculty do. And I don't think that's a good thing, but I think that's probably how it's evolved a lot over the years. And I know colleagues at other research universities in my area, some of them have pretty elaborate systems for accounting for that as part of your teaching load, and others of them just assume that because you're a faculty member with a research load teaching doctoral students, you'll just do the advising and the supervision and that sort of thing. Shannon David, curious about how the 793 independent studies and 794 practicum classes are handled across campus. So I think both of those are really good questions. Does anybody want to chime in and tell us how you do it in your departments? So either the doctoral or thesis advising or the independent studies and the practicum courses. No one wants to jump in?
I can share that in the PT&E the portfolio guidelines, it's been always listed under teaching section, not the service section.
I think that if I'm interpreting the consultants correctly, I think when we get their report, I think we'll get a really good idea about, at least on a department by department basis, how those things are handled, whether or not they're incorporated into load or not, where they're put into load, and that sort of thing. I think that maybe they came in with an expectation that, independent study or practicum or field experience or a didactic class or a lab or a seminar were all pretty much one-to-one in terms of load and how we think about them. But the sense I have is that that's not the case. At least it's not the case across our departments. So I think that we'll get a better sense of that, and I hope that those data will help us see how things are distributed and maybe figure out the best way to do it. Because I do think that a lot of that is technically done as offload, and I don't think that's the right way to do it, but I think it's just kind of the point that we've evolved to, given the limited resources that we have in a lot of our departments. From Sarah, for clarity, are workload agreement adjustments prospective or retrospective? They should be prospective. So when you do a workload agreement, it should be for the upcoming year. So when we do them in HDFS, we do them in August, early September for that year. School of Ed does them in April or May for the upcoming year. They should define what a faculty member will be doing in the upcoming year, not what they did in the previous year. Stephanie Day, if teaching expectations vary over 2 years, similar to the polymers and coating model, how does this work with an updated program description every year? That's a really good question. I would think that what they would do there is, it's, you would simply say, this year you're teaching 2 courses, and the next year with your workload agreement, you say you're teaching 1 course, so it's going to reflect what you're doing. And for departments that have those variable loads from year to year, I think that it's why it's so important to do it on a year-to-year basis so that you get something there that accurately reflects it. Okay, from Mark Harvey, as you know, we had much difficulty last year trying to determine allocation of effort for a faculty member with a split appointment between history department and School of Ed. I wonder if you have thoughts about the best practices for how to allocate effort with split appointments. And Mark's grinning now. Yeah. No, my thoughts about best practices there would just be don't do it. Don't do any split appointments. I think that would be
Stop.
better. That's a really good question. The consultants brought that up in our meeting as well, because it's an issue, right? It's an issue if you're working with Department A and their teaching expectations are 2 and 1, and you're working with Department 2 and their teaching expectations are 2 and 2. How do you do it? Because you're going to end up with a higher teaching load than you would have had if you were purely in one department, and a lower teaching load if you were in the other department, purely in the other department. This gets me in trouble sometimes, but in 34 years in the field, my perspective has always been that everything can be handled quantitatively, right? If you can analyze things quantitatively, you can fix the problem. And that's how I would approach it. If you work out a position description for each part of that appointment, and you do it based on the math, based on the typical percentages for the department where the split occurs, with the caveat that you have to be really careful and make sure that you don't do something that is really onerous for faculty. And I think that's why you start out with that formula, but then you have to look at it and you have to ask yourself, is this reasonable? Because, when we just apply formula blindly, then sometimes what we do is we put people in a bad position, and we put them in a position that's not conducive to their progress, to their professional development. So I would start just by applying the math to each appointment and seeing what that looks like, and then stepping back and asking if it's reasonable or not. And if it is, then move forward with it. And if not, you make some adjustments. I mean, I'm a firm believer in standard workloads, right? We've had those in HDFS for a long, long time. I think standard workloads take away a lot of confusion. Standard workloads give you something to base everything else on. But I'm also a firm believer in the idea that nobody in the department may actually have the standard workload, right? You do what is needed by the department, you do what is needed by the faculty member, and you do what is reasonable. And I've always, as a department head, I always appreciated that flexibility. I always appreciated being able to make changes and to do what was best for people. And I think that's critical. And I think, I think you're right. It was, the situation you're talking about, Mart, was a difficult one in a way, but I think we ended up with a very reasonable solution that was good all the way around. I think, probably nobody got everything they wanted. Everybody got something that they wanted, and everybody walked away happy, which I think is a win, is a positive situation.
Yeah, excuse me, Jim, this is David Bertolini. Could I just jump in on this? Because one is, I'll say what you just said differently, is I think the core of the error, because joint appointments are highly valued from my perspective, but I think the core, the problem was the lack of specificity at the very beginning, meaning all the things you just described, meaning it was a broad-based, 45, 55% of effort, blah, blah, blah. And down the road, it just caused problems. So I think the point of this exercise, and I'm glad that this is going on. So I thank John and the provost for doing this, is the goal is to be as specific as possible, even though we get kind of caught up in that. And so like, even to answer Amy's question, because this has been talked about before, is, I was told by previous chairs that the sort of extra thesis type stuff was kind of being rolled into the service because it was 20%, which is a high amount. But that to me is just very vague, right?
Yeah.
So I guess to answer, just to reiterate what you said, is the more specific we can be is benefiting everybody in the long run. So.
Yeah, and when I said don't do joint appointments, I was hopefully obviously joking, because we do a lot of
no, I got the joke too. I get it.
But to go back to what David said, we can look at the appointment that we were talking about. We can also look at a handful of other split appointments that were created around that same time that all suffer from the same problem. And as David pointed out, it is a lack of specificity. It's a position description in the letter of offer that was vague, and that for a couple of the other ones that are, you know, the one we're talking about was highly specific compared to a couple of other ones that I have that were just very, very general. And generality is not a good thing here. David's absolutely right. We want to be very specific here at from the point of hire.
Yeah, I would just add that just to sort of reword what Jim just said, that was really a big part of the problem with this particular case, was that a lot of it went back to the contract letter for this individual. Well, the contract letter doesn't specifically say what you now want this faculty person to do 6 years down the road. So there was all this angst about the contract letter and how come the contract letter didn't stipulate what the individual was supposed to do.
Yeah.
And then you start pointing fingers at how people wrote the contract letter. Oh, good grief. Talk about going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing to keep in mind with that is while, you know, 4 of us are sitting here having administrative discussions about why is it this way? How do we fix this? What should the end look like? You know, you got a faculty member who's sitting there wondering, okay, what's my year going to look like? How is this going to impact me? How is this going to impact my ability to get my research done? What is going to do? What is it going to do to my teaching? So it's not just an administrative issue or an administrative exercise. It's impacting somebody's life for that period of time until we get it resolved. And I think we ought to always do whatever we do. We ought to do with as much. Struggling for words here. We got to do with as much attention as possible to doing the right thing for the faculty member.
Sorry to interrupt. Thank you for saying that, Jim. I agree wholeheartedly about what you just said. I wanted to back up to that comment about the prospective workloads that we're doing ahead of the year, so we know what the expectations are. In HSC, we would periodically have to amend them as well. If something changed during the year, say somebody became ill and someone else picked up their class, both of those workloads would change. If somebody gets a large grant and ends up buying out time, you know, that so they're not written in stone, but what you do is just keep the amended version with the original version and adjust as necessary. So I just wanted to throw that in, and I'll be quiet now.
So a couple more questions here. Are there workloads across campus that play to faculty strengths? For example, if the person is primarily a researcher, do you give them a higher research workload, lower teaching load? If they're a great educator, you give them a higher teaching load, less research. We have done that some. And there are other departments that I know of who have done that. Typically in our college, we have waited to do that till post-tenure. I think there is an expectation that in the first 6 years, things are relatively standard, right? You're expecting everybody to cover both teaching and research. But after that, then we have done workloads that play to those strengths. So somebody who's really good at getting grants, you know, you increase their research time, they're buying out courses, you reduce their teaching load. Other people who are, you know, for whatever reason, wanting to reduce their teaching, their research load a little bit, increase their teaching. You know, it's a win-win. It gives you, it gives you a place to move those courses away from the people who are doing more research, and you've got somebody who's happy to do it and likes doing it. You know, but I think there's a lot of variability there in terms of what departments approve and what they don't approve. I think there's also a concern that, you know, we've had some issues on this campus over the last 10 years in terms of getting people out of associate professor positions and moving them into full professor positions. We've had a number of, you know, seminars and luncheons and discussions about, you know, why do you need to move on to full professor and what does it take and things like that. So I think departments are leery of doing anything at the associate level as well that would impede people moving on to full. Another question: in determining standard load, do you take into account small enrollment courses versus large enrollment? What if one faculty is teaching a 3-credit course with 200 students and others teaching a 3-credit course with only 30 students? Yeah, and what about, teaching a doctoral seminar with 10 students? We in HDFS do not distinguish among those, and I don't think anybody in our college does in HSE. But it's my understanding that there are some departments across campus that do, that a large lecture class is counted differently than a small lecture class, which is counted differently than a graduate seminar. So yeah, and I think the nice thing about the campus, I think, is that upper administration uh, leaves us free to make those distinctions for ourselves. And I think that's a highly I think that's a highly variable kind of thing. It's from discipline to discipline. I think it's also highly variable from faculty member to faculty member. Early in my career, I taught survey courses with 175, 200 students, and I actually enjoyed those more than graduate seminars. I enjoy big classes. I enjoy the crowd and all that. I just have a lot of fun with that, and I for a while was very, very self-conscious in the seminar classes with 8 or 10 students sitting around watching me and listening to every word. So I think there's a lot of variability there, and I appreciate the fact that administration lets us do that. The second question was, what about differences in research activity? How do you determine standard expectations? And that's a really good question, because the PTE guidelines say there's no formula. I think a lot of departments on campus define what kind of output is necessary if you have the standard workload. So if you have 40% research appointment, a lot of departments define what that means in terms of articles submitted or articles in press or professional presentations or grant submissions or actually having grants. So there is a lot of variability there as well, with some departments really spelling that out and other departments leaving it a little bit vaguer. What else can we talk about? It's actually a much more exciting topic than it seems on the surface.
So Jim, just to be clear, then
Yeah.
your recommendation is that these allocation of efforts be updated yearly, and B, that they ideally be done in the spring with an eye to looking forward to the next academic year's allocation of effort. Is that right?
Yeah, I think recommendation maybe it's not the right word. I think that from the state board's perspective, it is a requirement that we update these yearly.
Okay.
And I think the university is going to, John, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think we are going to move to a late spring, early summer update. So we've got a prospective workload agreement for the coming year. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. They're requiring that we have our normal contracts, page 1, and then page 2 has to be the workload distribution, where it spells out what percentage of the workload is research, teaching, and service.
So Amy, you said perhaps they should be linked with the FAR. That's not an acronym that I'm familiar with.
The faculty annual report.
That would certainly be a place to put it. I think that the conversation right now is primarily linking it with the contract for the next year, but the annual report might be a place to do it as well. Yeah. And Susan said that seems to make sense to me. The only concern I have with that would be that we turn in those faculty annual reports in February, and a lot could change between then and June. So you might have to do an updating of it. I'd prefer to do it a little closer to the start of the next academic year, I think.
But
Yes, I only mention it because I'm new faculty, and so I'm trying to get a sense of the timing for everything.
Yeah.
And so I'm not being, well, I mean, taken off guard, I guess, or I'm still trying to get the sense of when everything is due.
Yeah.
The annual reports do take some time, and so just finish those. And so just getting a sense of the timing of everything would be really helpful for me.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the fact that so many of our timelines seem to make absolutely no sense from an effective perspective is probably not helping at all, right? So, yeah, I certainly understand that. Mark, did you have a comment?
Well, maybe you already said this, but my understanding is that the allocation of effort needs to be attached to or included in the annual faculty evaluation letter that goes to the dean.
True, but the evaluation that if I'm understanding you correctly, the evaluation that goes to the dean would use the current year's workload agreement allocation, not the next year's
I
allocation.
see.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Okay. So then the assembling of next year's allocation of effort, which would come in the late spring, would necessarily be a separate action?
It would be, yeah, and in fact, the more I think about it, the annual evaluation would feed into the individual's preparation of the workload agreement for the next year, I think, because you would have the discussion with the department head and any adjustments or changes in teaching load or changes in research assignment, things like that, you would be able to do after the annual report evaluation, and then you would do it and prepare it for the next year. Again, we've always done it in the fall. The template comes around, or else the department head works with you, and we do them in the fall, and that's always worked real well for us. But I can see where there would be some wisdom to having it in place before the semester actually started, before everything started going. From Ken, from a faculty workload availability perspective, I would think having an April deadline. Yeah, that would be, that's about halfway in between. That's splitting the distance between the annual report deadline and the contract deadline. It seems, because I remember when we first started doing this when I was department head, and it just seemed like an enormous pain in the butt to do these every year, to have faculty prepare them, to submit them, to go over them, to sign them, to get them to the dean. And actually, once you get a template and once you know what these are going to look like, and you get the process started, it actually goes very, very quickly. I do think, though, that having a departmental template works very, very well from an administrative perspective. Obviously, you need some flexibility, but if there are core things that are the same across faculty, it makes it really easy to look at, to evaluate, to understand, to put an individual in context with the rest of the faculty in the department. And it really, once you get that done and once you get the process started, it really does not take much time. And it really is a pretty easy thing to do. Well, yeah, I'll send the PowerPoint slides to John and will that work, John? If I send them to you, can you make them available?
We'll post them.
And I assume that we'll have a policy change at some point as well to reflect the board's interpretation and whatever documents that we choose, that this will go through that process.
It's not going to be a policy change because these are procedures. The policy will remain the same. It will be just procedures, clarification of the procedures. Any other questions for Jim?
Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you all.